My parents funded my brother's mansion, then asked me to pay their taxes. I always thought family was supposed to be fair, but sitting in my cramped apartment scrolling through social media, I saw my brother posting pictures of his new swimming pool and realized how naive I'd been. The contrast between his marble countertops and my secondhand furniture hit me like a punch to the gut. Growing up, we were middle-class kids with parents who worked hard, but never seemed to have enough money for luxuries like vacation trips or brand-name clothes. My brother was 3 years older and somehow always managed to charm our parents into giving him whatever he wanted. While I learned early that asking for anything beyond basics was met with lectures about money being tight. When I turned 18, I moved out to attend college and worked multiple jobs to pay for my education and living expenses. Every semester was a struggle between textbooks and groceries, between rent and gas money. My parents occasionally sent $20 here and there, but mostly I was on my own. Meanwhile, my brother stayed home for an extra year after high school, claiming he needed time to figure out his path. During that year, he spent most days playing video games and hanging out with friends, while our parents covered all his expenses without complaint. The first real shock came when my brother announced he was starting his own business. I was excited for him until I learned that our parents had given him $50,000 as startup capital. When I called to congratulate him, my mother casually mentioned they'd taken out a second mortgage on their house to help him get started. The same parents who told me they couldn't afford to help with my college tuition had just handed my brother enough money to buy a decent car. I hung up feeling like someone had rearranged my entire understanding of our family dynamics. My brother's business took off faster than anyone expected, and within 2 years he was making more money than both our parents combined. He bought a house in an expensive neighborhood and started posting pictures of his renovations on social media. Every weekend seemed to bring new purchases: a boat, expensive furniture, designer clothes. I was happy for his success, but something felt off about how quickly everything had happened. When I visited for his housewarming party, I noticed our parents seemed unusually involved in discussing his business decisions and financial planning. The truth about their arrangement came out during a family dinner when my brother mentioned needing to restructure some investments. Our father made a comment about hoping the tax implications wouldn't affect their partnership, and suddenly pieces started clicking together. Over the following weeks, I managed to piece together that our parents hadn't just given my brother startup money, they'd become silent partners in his business, providing ongoing funding in exchange for a percentage of profits. What I'd thought was a one-time gift was actually a sophisticated financial arrangement that had been generating income for them. My aunt called me crying about my parents' debt situation. 6 months later, my aunt called me in tears saying our parents were about to lose their house. She'd been helping them with paperwork and discovered they owed over $30,000 in back taxes. The second mortgage payments combined with their regular expenses had stretched them too thin, and they'd been ignoring tax bills for 2 years. My aunt begged me to help them, saying I was the only family member with a steady income who might be able to contribute. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my brother was building his mansion, our parents were drowning in debt. I drove to their house that evening to understand the full scope of their financial crisis. The kitchen table was covered with unpaid bills, tax notices, and legal documents. My mother looked exhausted as she explained how they'd been robbing Peter to pay Paul for months, using credit cards to cover basic expenses. They'd invested so heavily in my brother's business that they'd neglected their own financial security. When I asked why they hadn't approached my brother for help, my father got defensive and said they didn't want to burden him during his expansion phase. The next day, I called my brother to explain the situation, expecting him to immediately offer assistance. Instead, he became evasive and mentioned that his business was going through some temporary cash flow issues. He suggested our parents should consider selling their house and moving to a smaller place, or maybe I could help them since I had fewer expenses. The casual way he dismissed their crisis, while posting pictures of his latest vacation, made my blood boil. I realized he'd been treating our parents' investment as free money rather than a loan or partnership that came with responsibilities. My brother's business partner revealed the real financial picture. 3 weeks later, I got an unexpected call from someone claiming to be my brother's business partner. He'd found my number in company records and wanted to warn me about what was really happening. We met at a coffee shop where he explained that my brother had been using the business as a personal piggy bank, taking money for luxury purchases that weren't business expenses. The profits that should have been going to our parents were being diverted to fund his lifestyle. Even worse, the business was actually struggling due to his mismanagement and excessive spending. This partner had been trying to address the issues internally, but my brother had been manipulating financial reports and hiding debts from everyone, including our parents. He showed me documents proving that the business owed significant money to suppliers and had been operating at a loss for months. My brother had been covering this up by taking advances against future profits that might never materialize. The partner was considering legal action, but wanted to give the family a chance to resolve things privately first. Armed with this information, I confronted my brother at his house the next evening. He tried to deny everything at first, but when I produced the documents, he broke down and admitted he'd been in over his head for months. The pressure of maintaining his lifestyle while keeping the business afloat had driven him to make increasingly desperate decisions. He'd been telling our parents that profits were being reinvested for growth, when actually he was using the money to prevent creditors from seizing assets. The swimming pool and renovations had been financed with money that should have been going to pay our parents their share. My parents threatened to disown me when I refused to enable them. When I told our parents about my brother's deception, they initially refused to believe me. My mother accused me of being jealous and trying to sabotage my brother's success. It took showing them the financial documents and arranging a meeting with the business partner before they accepted the truth. Even then, their reaction surprised me. Instead of being angry with my brother, they seemed more concerned about protecting him from consequences. They asked me to help cover the tax debt so the family wouldn't fall apart publicly. I explained that I couldn't afford to pay $30,000, and more importantly, I wouldn't enable their pattern of bailing out my brother while expecting nothing in return. This triggered an explosive argument where my father accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. He claimed they'd sacrificed everything for their children, and now I was abandoning them in their time of need. My mother started crying and said she'd never expected one of her sons to be so heartless. The emotional manipulation was intense, but I held firm in my position. Over the following days, they enlisted other family members to pressure me into changing my mind. My aunt called daily with guilt trips about how I was letting my parents lose their home. Cousins I barely spoke to suddenly started reaching out with stories about family loyalty and responsibility. The social media posts from family gatherings stopped including me, and I realized I was being systematically excluded from family events. My parents had essentially declared war on me for refusing to clean up the mess they'd created by enabling my brother. The situation escalated when my mother called to inform me that unless I helped with the taxes, they would consider me no longer part of the family. She said they'd rather lose their house than have a son who wouldn't help his own parents. The ultimatum felt surreal. They were willing to disown me for not solving a problem created by their favoritism toward my brother. I told her I needed time to think, but honestly, I was starting to realize that maybe being cut off from this toxic dynamic wouldn't be the worst thing that could happen to me. My brother's business collapsed and he moved back home. 2 months after our confrontation, my brother's business partner followed through on his threat to pursue legal action. Within weeks, creditors were seizing assets and the business was forced into bankruptcy. My brother lost everything: the house, the car, the boat, and all the luxury items he'd accumulated. The financial investigation revealed even more misappropriation of funds, and criminal charges were being considered. Suddenly, the golden child who could do no wrong was facing the possibility of jail time for fraud and embezzlement. Our parents' reaction was to welcome him back home with open arms, despite their own financial crisis. They moved him into his old bedroom and started talking about how they'd help him rebuild his life. The same parents who were about to lose their house due to his actions were now taking on additional expenses to support him. They maxed out credit cards to pay for his legal representation and started liquidating their retirement savings to cover his debts. Watching them destroy their own financial future to protect him was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The house finally went into foreclosure 3 months later. My parents had to move into a small apartment and my brother moved with them. I heard through extended family that they were all living together in a cramped space, struggling to afford basic necessities. The irony was overwhelming. The child they'd invested everything in had cost them their home and their financial security. Yet they still blamed me for not helping, as if $30,000 from my modest income could have solved problems that ran into hundreds of thousands. My aunt occasionally updated me on their situation, always with the hint that I should reconsider my position. She'd describe how my mother looked tired and stressed, how my father seemed defeated, how my brother was struggling to find work with his legal troubles. But she never mentioned them taking responsibility for their choices, or my brother showing genuine remorse for the damage he'd caused. They were still operating under the assumption that family meant unconditional financial support, regardless of how irresponsible the recipient had been. The criminal investigation revealed my parents were complicit. 8 months after the business collapse, the criminal investigation into my brother's activities took an unexpected turn. Detectives contacted me asking about my parents' role in the business, and I learned that they were being investigated as potential co-conspirators. The financial records showed they'd been aware of irregularities for months, but had helped cover them up to protect their investment. What I'd thought was naive parental enabling was actually active participation in financial fraud. The investigation revealed that my parents had helped my brother create fake invoices and manipulate accounting records to hide the money he was taking from the business. They'd coached him on how to deflect questions from his business partner and had even helped him move money into accounts that would be harder to trace. Their desperation to protect their investment had led them to become accomplices in crimes that could result in prison time. The parents who'd portrayed themselves as victims were actually co-conspirators in a scheme that had defrauded investors and creditors. This revelation completely changed my perspective on everything that had happened. I realized that their request for me to pay their taxes wasn't just about favoritism. It was about covering up their own criminal activity. They'd wanted me to help them avoid consequences for choices that went far beyond poor financial planning. The guilt trips and emotional manipulation had been attempts to make me an unknowing participant in their cover-up. I felt sick thinking about how close I'd come to enabling their crimes through misguided family loyalty. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, with my parents and brother all facing potential prison sentences. I watched from a distance as the family that had tried to guilt me into financial support fell apart completely. Extended family members who'd pressured me to help them gradually stopped calling as the truth about their criminal behavior became public. The same relatives who'd accused me of being heartless were now distancing themselves from the scandal to protect their own reputations. My parents' arrest made local news and changed everything. The final blow came when my parents and brother were arrested simultaneously in a coordinated raid. The local news covered the story extensively, describing it as a family-run financial fraud scheme that had cost investors over $2 million. Seeing their mugshots on television and reading about their crimes in the newspaper was surreal. These were the same people who'd raised me to believe in honesty and hard work, yet they'd spent years engaged in sophisticated financial crimes. The media attention made it impossible for anyone to maintain the fiction that they'd been innocent victims of circumstances. Court documents revealed the extent of their deception, including evidence that they'd been planning to flee the country if the investigation had gotten too close. They'd already transferred money to overseas accounts and had been researching countries without extradition treaties. The parents who'd accused me of abandoning them had been preparing to abandon the country rather than face consequences for their actions. My former coworkers started asking me about the news coverage, and I had to explain that I'd been estranged from my family for months due to their behavior. Some people seemed skeptical, assuming I must have known about their crimes, while others were supportive and said they admired my decision to stay away from the situation. The social isolation was difficult, but I realized that being connected to their criminal enterprise would have been far worse than the loneliness of cutting ties. The trial lasted several months, with each family member trying to minimize their own culpability while blaming the others. My brother claimed our parents had pressured him into illegal activities, while they insisted he'd manipulated them into helping him cover up crimes they didn't understand. The judge wasn't impressed by their attempts to shift blame and sentenced all three of them to significant prison time. The family that had tried to guilt me into supporting them financially was now costing taxpayers money to house in federal prison. Sitting in my apartment reading about their sentencing, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The family dynamics that had seemed merely dysfunctional had actually been covering up serious criminal behavior. My refusal to pay their taxes hadn't just been about fairness, it had been about avoiding complicity in their cover-up. The guilt trips and emotional manipulation had been attempts to make me an unwitting participant in their crimes. I'd lost my family, but I'd kept my integrity and my freedom. The house they'd lost to foreclosure was eventually sold at auction, and the proceeds went to pay restitution to their victims. The mansion my brother had built with stolen money was seized and sold, with the proceeds also going to victims. All the luxury items and investments they'd accumulated through fraud were liquidated to compensate the people they defrauded. In the end, their criminal enterprise had cost them everything they'd gained and more. 5 years later, I'm still rebuilding my life and learning to trust my instincts about people and relationships. The experience taught me that family loyalty doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone's self-destruction. I've built new relationships based on mutual respect and honesty, rather than the manipulation and guilt that characterized my family dynamics. The apartment that once felt cramped compared to my brother's mansion now feels like a sanctuary where I can live according to my own values. I occasionally wonder what would have happened if I'd given in to their pressure and paid those taxes. Would I have been drawn deeper into their criminal enterprise? Would I have ended up in prison alongside them? The what-ifs are endless, but I'm grateful that my instinct to protect my own financial stability ended up protecting me from much worse consequences. Sometimes the people who accuse you of being selfish are actually asking you to sacrifice yourself for their benefit, and recognizing that distinction can save your life.